3 o'clock. Those of us that are in the television world, we try to stay on time as much as we can. My name is Bob Gordon. I'm Interim Chair of Media Arts, and I'm glad that you all have come. This is going to be great. I met Meribah, well, I guess it was last year sometime. I was minding my own business, and I listened to her podcast, The Kids of Rutherford County, about the criminal court system in this county, which has ended up arresting and jailing an awful lot of minors, some of which as young as 7. And she had done a podcast with ProPublica and New York Times on that, which got a lot of national attention. And she came here and talked to faculty and staff. And then I guess I was minding my own business and listened to her next podcast, Supermajority, about 3 conservative Christian Republican covenant moms that tried to appeal to the legislature to change gun laws in Tennessee, and she will tell you about their path and their success. So I wanted to also thank the university's Honors College. This podcast, Meribah talking about her podcast, is part of the MTSU University Honors College Fall 2024 Honors Lecture Series on Democracy. She's addressing how democracy is being challenged in our own backyard. The Honors College is providing the speaker's honorarium, and additionally we thank MTSU NT Engage program here during NT Engage Week for providing us a small reception after the program, and the College of Education for allowing us to use this space. So please stick around afterwards and talk to Meribah if you'd like with any extra questions. Also, Mary Evans from the Honors College reminded me to remind you to pick up voter registration cards. Part of what we hope you do after this is vote in any way that the Spirit pushes you. Okay, so I thought maybe before we start, I might be able to show you some information that might put things in perspective a little bit. I was surprised when I found this out. Tennessee politics, the most recent information I can find anywhere, and even Pew Research told me this is as most recent you can get. 48% of voters in Tennessee identify themselves as Republican, 36% Democrat, 15% independent, which is fine. Every state's different. But as we go through this, 100% of the following offices are Republican: Governor, State Speaker of the House, President of the State Senate, Attorney General, Secretary of State. 100% of Tennessee's U.S. Senators are Republican. 89% of U.S. Representatives are. 82% of the state senators are. 76% of the state representatives are. You can see there's a trend here. 100% of the state 5 Supreme Court justices are Republican. 100% of state legislative committees are chaired by Republicans. 50% of state election commissions are Republican. There's kind of a summary of all of them. But 48% Republican voters are Republican, but if you add Democrat voters and independent, that comes to 51%. So there's kind of a difference between what citizens identify themselves as and how our system works in the state. And you can see why these 3 mothers had some difficulty. So I'm going to sit down and keep my mouth shut after introducing you all to our guest and our topic, and let her talk to you about her podcast. Everybody say hi to Meribah Knight.
Can you guys hear me with this live on? I feel like I can hear myself. Okay, cool. Great. Oh, cool. So you've got my whole thing.
I've got your whole thing.
Awesome.
There for you. There's water for you.
There I am.
Have fun.
Okay, wonderful. Hi guys. Thank you so much. Let me grab my other water. Keep me hydrated. Well, thank you so much for having me. I want to kind of talk through this story and get any questions that you guys have. This is a story that, I'm a journalist. I'm not an activist. I'm not a political consultant. I look for interesting stories. I look for stories that feel relevant to the moment that we live in, that might help us make sense of the world that we live in. And I have never reported on politics before. I've reported on a lot of stories that deal with policy and how policy like works on the ground. But I think that for anybody who's kind of been paying attention to the country, but also to the state, our politics and our legislature make some really critical decisions and that affect our lives on a day-to-day basis. And I became really interested in trying to understand what was happening up on Capitol Hill, and what did it look like, and was it really truly representative government? And so I embarked on this series to just start with the special session which happened last August around public safety following the Covenant shooting, and then to go into the regular session and really to kind of be like this immersed, like embedded reporter with a set of characters and stakes. But whenever I think about like what is it that I'm trying to do a story on, what is this, like I really try to distill it to its essence, because that's going to help me really, you know, what's my true north of the story. And in this case, as it is with a lot of stories, this story is about power, right? These, when we elect people into office, we are giving them the power to make decisions on our behalf. You may wonder, like, why do people want to be world leaders? What's in it for them? It's power. I mean, people to like having power to varying degrees, some more than others. But essentially what this story felt like it boiled down to was a story about power and who held that power and how they were wielding that power. And what happened when your constituency, like any democracy, tries to challenge that power, especially from inside your own party, which is, I'll get to kind of that in the characters of this story, the subjects of the story. But yeah, so as I said, you know, it's a story about the party that has power, and what a great kind of primer Robert set up, which is that like they have a lot of power. Like they, the Republican Party has a supermajority here. They occupy the vast majority of like elected and appointed positions in power, in politics and leadership in the state. And so really, if you take that subject of power a step further, the question is, what is, who is in power and what are they doing with that power? I first started to think about this story not as a story about gun control or the Tennessee Three who were, you know, threatened to be expelled and two of whom were expelled. I really started to think about the story through the lens of democracy. And a big part of kind of what I was seeing in the national headlines about what was going on in Tennessee was this idea about whether this stuff was constitutional, whether it was democratic. People were really taking notice of Tennessee, and as a reporter who lives in the state that I report, I like to try to find stories that I feel can be helpful to the citizenry here, but also speak to a larger universal truth that is, you know, in the zeitgeist, like things that we're thinking about and talking about. It really felt like more and more in Tennessee, we were being looked at as this place that was really pushing the boundaries of what democracies can do and what how we kind of wield that power, like when you have it. But I want to play for you a clip. I don't know if anybody followed the expulsions of Justin Jones and Justin Pearson, but just a quick like lead up, you know, the shooting at Covenant happened, then there was lots of protests a few days later. Justin Jones, Justin Pearson, Gloria Johnson walked onto the well of the State House with a bullhorn and some signs, essentially kind of taking what was being protested outside, like walking it into the House chamber and disrupting the proceedings there. And it was because of that that Republicans filed resolutions to expel them from the State House. It was really an unprecedented move, which is why you had all these headlines. But also, shortly after, a couple days after they were voted on to be expelled, there was this tape. There was this kind of, it was leaked to the Tennessee Holler, which is a liberal news outlet, and it was essentially the Republican caucus getting together, talking about what happened. And if anyone remembers, so there was the 2 black lawmakers were expelled, and the white lawmaker, Gloria Johnson, was not expelled by a single vote by a Republican. And so this is a Republican caucus, and they're sitting around a table basically yelling at that guy, like, what the hell, you're making us look like racists. But also talking about the general kind of like, what is it that we are up against? And Scott Sapicki, who's a representative in the House, said something really interesting in this, and I'm just gonna play this.
A few days after the expulsions and the backlash, a recording of Tennessee's House Republican caucus meeting was leaked to a local liberal news outlet, the Tennessee Holler. The audio was apparently edited and doesn't capture the voices of everyone in the meeting.
We are fighting for the republic of our country right now.
We are fighting for the republic of our country right now, Representative Scott Sapicki tells the group.
And the world is staring at us. Are we going to stand our ground? You've got to do what's right. Even if you think it might be wrong, you've got to do what's right.
You gotta do what's right, even if you think it might be wrong. That's a little excerpt from the podcast. But like this quote, like what Scott Sapicki was saying, it felt frankly a little bit scary. It felt like we'd entered into this realm of politics, which was like, even if you think it might be wrong, you have to do what's like what was it that, how was he making this calculation? This felt to me like this is what the Republicans who have the power, they knew they could use that power. And even if you think it might be wrong, you've got to do what's right because this is the republic of our country and we have to save our republic. And so it was like really kind of this Machiavellian, like by any means necessary, we will do what we need to do to save the republic in the way that we think it needs to be saved in our vision. And that crossed to me a very scary line. And as a journalist, it's something that I felt like, you know, this is not just about gun control. This is not just about safety of our children. This is literally about one party pulling the levers of power in ways that they know might not be quite right, but will get them to the end result that they want. And that felt like a real shift in our political rhetoric. It felt like a shift in our political behavior. And it really, frankly, it kind of got under my skin. And so I felt like, Scott Sapicki in that moment is really showing his cards. He was on to say, or maybe it's another lawmaker who's on to say, like, the left wants us so bad. If Tennessee falls, the rest of the South will fall. Like, they see themselves as kind of this last bastion of conservative values. And what did that mean? That, like, to them, what's right might be what's something wrong to other people, but that didn't matter. And so the moment we get into that kind of territory of saying like where you're kind of double speaking, that to me felt really scary. And so obviously I was paying very close attention to what was happening, all the while thinking about, I want to tell a story about this moment. This moment feels like a very different moment. And then
A few days after.
Sorry. And then a little bit later, this article, which got shared a lot, came out in the Atlantic, and it was by this writer, Ann Applebaum. And this, I don't know if anybody read it here, but this was the single kind of most important thing that I read that I felt like, okay, this is what I'm feeling. I'm thinking this. I'm feeling like all of these really critical big questions about democracy, about representative government, about all these things that, like, is that still true here? Like, what is happening to our state when it feels like one party has so much control and they don't need to listen to the other side? They just don't have to. They don't need the votes. And so this was really kind of the table setter for this show, and it was a story that I felt really encapsulated what my biggest concerns were and what I wanted to try to figure out as a reporter to go in and report on. Like, is Tennessee a democracy? Good question, open question. And so I want to play a little bit of kind of the context of the writer and why it was so really kind of staggering for me to read this story.
And then, a few months after the expulsions of Pearson and Jones and the leaked audio, an article began to circulate. It was called, "Is Tennessee a Democracy?" I sent it to people. People sent it to me. It was by the journalist and historian, Ann Applebaum.
Ann Applebaum, in your latest article for The Atlantic, entitled, "Is Tennessee a Democracy?" you discuss what happens after one party wins everything, but still wants more.
And it created such buzz that she went on cable news to talk about it.
One of the effects of having a supermajority, which the Republicans have in Tennessee, is that they don't really have to listen to anybody. They don't have to listen to the public. They don't have to listen to the Democrats. They don't have to listen to political opponents.
Part of why the piece struck me so is because Applebaum has spent her entire career writing about authoritarian regimes in Central and Eastern Europe. And what's happening in Tennessee, she says, it reminds her of those places.
And of course, I picked on Tennessee, but there are a number of other states I could have been to where you have almost the same phenomenon.
The phenomenon she's talking about are these politically lopsided legislatures, like Tennessee. There are now 29 states, more than ever before, with legislative supermajorities. 20 of those are Republican. And to clarify, having a supermajority generally means one party has a steep advantage over the other. In Tennessee, Republicans outnumber Democrats in the legislature, 3-1.
So when I found this article, when I started thinking about it, it really felt to me that that was the question that I wanted to ask. And I wanted to try to use characters and good reporting and real on-the-ground reporting to figure out the answer to that question, or at least to see it really on the ground. And when Ann Applebaum, so I'll reiterate, like, she is not a national reporter. She is an international reporter who lives part of the time in Warsaw, in Poland, and the other time, part of the time in DC, and her expertise is in Poland, Hungary, like all these authoritarian regimes in these other parts of the world, and what she was seeing here was too familiar, and that should wake us all up. But essentially, it's not just in Tennessee. I mean, what we see is other states, like she said, have these supermajorities that people are suddenly starting to question. North Carolina, Wisconsin, Ohio, all of these places, there's now, I mean, I talked to the folks that wrote these books, Laboratories Against Democracy. It was so fascinating to suddenly feel like I had opened up this like kind of portal, and it was like there was all these people that had been talking about how state legislatures were increasingly holding so much power. And as there was gridlock in Congress, and as nobody was really making decisions on a federal level, that the agendas for some of these special interest groups had been pushed down to the state level. And through redistricting and gerrymandering and all these things, that they'd start to consolidate this power on the state level, almost right under our noses, while we weren't really paying attention. And that felt incredibly important. It felt like something that I really wanted to try to dive into in the story. And then, like, this is all, I mean, I'm kind of mixing in the stuff that I ended up producing, but this was like, this is my thinking, right? I'm kind of like, okay, what's happening in Tennessee? Okay, does it relate to what's happening in other parts of the country? Yes, but also, like, we're an extreme example. But how extreme are we? How extreme, what is our democratic backsliding? Well, I talked to this one researcher, Jake Grumbach, who wrote the Laboratories Against Democracy, and he had this startling statistic. He had basically built this statistical model to, from 2000 to 2018, he tracked all these different things, like voting access, incarceration rates, like voter disenfranchisement, all of, like, it was 61 different indicators. He put them into the statistical model, and what it spit out was over the past 18 years, Tennessee had the most democratic backsliding of any state in the entire US. So that's when I was like, okay, clearly this is not something I've made up in my imagination. Clearly this is something that's happening. And Tennessee feels like, a lot of times it's overlooked because it's not a swing state, right? We're not Florida or Ohio or Wisconsin. We're not really like consequential in national elections. But yet here we are, this story that is being told by this researcher is that we have had this massive amount of democratic erosion. And so that felt really, really critical to me. And it felt like something that that is what I wanted to explore in my work. And so then as a storyteller, you're thinking, okay, like, what do I do? Like, what is it that is going to hold this story? I have to tell a story. I can't just talk about a topic. It's not a book report. It's not a history lesson. This has to be a story that pulls people in and makes them want to listen. And the thing that I started to pay attention to, obviously, was the power, right? I talked about how this is a story of power, and who has the power? Republicans. And so when I started to meet some of the folks at the State House that were newer arrivals at the State House, and realized that they themselves were Republicans, they themselves were conservatives, they were political newcomers, they'd never been active before in politics. That I started to gravitate to, because it felt like at the heart of this story, at the heart of like this consolidation of power, was a question of like, what is this a battle for the soul of the Republican Party? Does every Republican feel like they want to change the rules to keep the power? Or are there Republicans that are unnerved by what's happening? And what I found was that there are many Republicans that are unnerved by what's going on. Their stories are, their voices are not very loud, but they're getting louder, and these women that I found represented that. So they walk into the State House thinking, my children survived a mass shooting, I need to go change gun laws, I'm a Republican, I'm a white lady, I'm a Christian, surely they will listen to me. And they didn't get listened to. And I really wanted to, but I started out from a position of not knowing whether they're going to be listened to, and I started to kind of say, like, to myself, well, if I can stick with them, if I can follow their journey, it's going to be a pretty incredible journey of political awakening, of engaging civically, of just getting to know who you are as a citizen and as a conservative, and what is it that you grew up believing, and what are you now seeing is different from that in your own party. And so that journey really, that felt like an important, and also kind of like a newer way to look at this, which was, this is not a Democrat versus Republican thing. This is a battle inside the Republican Party for the direction and where it's going to go, and how much are they going to reach for those levers of power, and are they going to do it in a democratic way, or are they going to do it in an anti-democratic way? And so really, that my idea was to tell a story that I hadn't heard before, to tell an intimate, really action-based story that looked at what was happening inside the Capitol from the perspective of these three women who also happen to be Republican and conservative. So I felt like if the power is being held by Republicans, and I'm a journalist and my job is to hold power to account, I want to go where the power is. And in this case, I could go to the lawmakers who are in power, and then I could go to these women who felt like they should be in connection to the power because of their political ideologies, but they're in real-time learning, A, they're not really, because their political ideologies in the end don't exactly line up with the Republican lawmakers that they're lobbying. And also, they're kind of looking at themselves and their belief system that they grew up with, and they're starting to challenge it. They're starting to grow, and they're starting to question things that they haven't questioned before, which is a really kind of exciting thing to capture as a reporter, because in a society that feels so polarized, that feels like nobody can change their mind about anything, it's really, really exciting to watch somebody change their mind. It's like, it feels like this really special moment. But they were up against a lot. And I really wanted to kind of set the stage of like, these aren't the folks that maybe have been at the Capitol every day for years. These are not necessarily like, they are literally just arriving. They are new, they are wide-eyed, but they're also carrying with them some real, like, baggage from the belief system that they grew up with. And this is Mary Joyce, one of the women who talked about kind of the beginning, this moment, which I was really interested in, this moment where they decided to get active, and kind of, what did that mean? What were they navigating?
I've never spoken out politically. I've always just kind of gone along with, with the family, and, oh, we're not Democrats, or, oh, we don't believe that.
Mary says her family are old school Southern conservatives, and that she didn't come from privilege. She was raised by a single mom, and money was tight. But Mary knows the expectations of a Southern woman like her. Her mother is a daughter of the American Revolution. It was drilled into her.
We are going to cross our legs, and we are not going to be offensive, and we are going to be polite and put together. I would wear, this is so embarrassing now. I would wear pearls running on the treadmill. There's that. I'm saying it out loud.
Even now, I've rarely seen such a put-together woman. Hair, makeup, eyelashes, all-day heels, always toting around her Louis Vuitton handbag. Her work bio lists one of her specialties as power mom.
And I loved it. I love being from the South. But I understand the rules of the South. Those unspoken, this is your role, and though we're independent, there's still this underlying, hey, just remember who you are. Just remember how things work.
So they were coming to this with all of that. And to me, that was really interesting because it's culture, right? It's belief systems. It's a thing that you have grown up with and you've always been told, like, you have to do it this way. You have to behave this way. You're living in a society, like, act pretty, look nice. And now they were still trying to act pretty and look nice, but they were trying to get stuff done. And they were realizing kind of the limits of that, but they were also trying to shed that at the same time. Like, it was so conflicting for them on a day-to-day basis as white Southern women to suddenly be these very outspoken advocates. And so following that, like, trying to understand how that was just feeling like inside their bones on like a cellular level, it was really interesting. But I really felt like it was important, if we're going to use them as like a vehicle, that like to establish that like this is them stepping out. Like, it might not be where other people are, but for them, they're stepping out. And really, when they were stepping out, like, they were trying to decide, well, do I take a little bit of that? Do I cross my legs? Do I look nice? Will they listen to me if I do that? And as they go along, they realize that no, they're not. No matter what they do, they're not going to listen to them. So it was so fascinating to see them moving through this conflict, through kind of shedding what they thought was kind of their, like, the currency that they had grown up with, and like walking into this new space and thinking about how, like, what is going to stick with them about what they grew up believing and what is changing. This is me talking to a woman, one of the three women, Sarah Shoup Newman, about kind of her evolution in this.
For Sarah, Mary, and Melissa, being a Republican went hand in hand with being a good conservative, a good Christian, a hard worker.
I look out for my neighbor. I welcome everybody. I think everybody should be fed and have a roof on their head and be taken care of and loved and given a chance in life. To me, those are conservative Christian values. And I assumed that that is also what it meant to be Republican.
But now, Sarah says she was questioning whether her assumptions about what the party stood for had prevented her from seeing the ways it was shifting. Can you describe, like, so much of our discussions are around kind of, is it possible to change your mind? What does it feel like, and is it hard to have your views challenged and to bend?
It's really hard. It's really hard, especially when, I've associated in my mind that my faith values are linked to voting a certain way. And I understand it myself, but I feel this need to explain it to all of my friends or all of the people. They're all going to think that I've given up my values, that I don't care about these things. And that's hard. I mean, I have a largely conservative family, and I know how many of them view these things.
So for her, like, this was I mean, for all the women, this is a really conflicting moment, right? And I think that was, listening to that, like, as a reporter, it was so helpful to understand, like, that this isn't just them walking in as a bunch of Republicans, and maybe a lot of Republicans walking in and voting a certain way. It's not them necessarily knowing that every single thing about the way they think as a Republican is aligned with the Republican Party, right? Like, this is something that is a real belief system that they have grown up surrounded by, and now they're starting to really interrogate that and to kind of line it up with like their living values and the way that's changed. And it was just so fascinating to see all of them have these different journeys as they went through the session, which is like where, you know, that was kind of the scaffolding. But they start to realize that, you know, they're not that different than the rest of their state, right? Like, this is a Vanderbilt poll, and I want to just take take a step aside. I mean, I mentioned this in the show, but I think this is really important, which is that we have like a very reputable pollster, John Gear, who does this a few times a year, and you know, the things that he keeps coming back with that the Republicans in the state legislature keep saying, like, I don't believe you, is this stuff around who supports kind of the more nuanced version of various kind of hot button issues. So this one is opinions on gun restriction. So, you know, Governor Lee, after Covenant, and these women were behind it, proposed a red flag law. And the Republicans in the State House just shut that down. He couldn't even introduce it. It was gonna get no votes. But here you see in the poll that a large number of Republicans, when they're asked, like, do you support this type of law that would temporarily restrict access to guns for individuals who might pose a risk? They say yes, they are. So it starts to, you know, it starts to break open this question of like, who is representing whom? Like, what are, if the Republicans are saying nobody wants this, but the polls are saying that they do, like, how do you reconcile that? And that was a big part of, you know, essentially this is kind of like the living experience of these women. They want these things, and guess what? They realize, I think a lot of Republicans want these things. And yet the Republicans in the State House are saying, no, they don't. So I'm going to play a little bit of tape.
Certainly do.
So, sorry, I just want to back up so I want to make sure I have it close. So, one of the more hardline Republicans in the legislature is a guy named Gino Bolso, and he's actually the representative for one of the women. There's three women I call, Melissa, Mary, and Sarah. Gino Bolso is Melissa's representative. And so she's incredibly like keyed in to the bills that he's proposing, which are quite out there, and how he is obstructing anything having to do with gun control legislation. And it's frustrating for her to see that she feels like her and her neighbors want these things, but her own representative is saying, no, you don't, I don't, I'm not going to vote for them. And so when I put that question and I put this kind of poll in front of Gino Bolso, this is part of our conversation.
Certainly over the last 10 to 12 years, the General Assembly has become more and more and more conservative. And I think that's reflective of the fact that over the last 10 to 12 years, Tennesseans, on the whole, have become more and more and more conservative.
The second part is not totally true. Tennessee's voters have elected conservative lawmakers time and time again. But within the Republican Party, there seems to be a disconnect between lawmakers and constituents. A recent poll from Vanderbilt University showed that, for example, a majority of Republicans in Tennessee support exceptions around abortion, and they also support some kind of gun control. But the legislature declines to take up this kind of legislation.
So I kind of repeated myself in that, but essentially when you talk to a legislator like Gino, he's saying, no, everybody in Tennessee is becoming more conservative. But then these numbers show maybe that's not so true. It's so confusing. So then when if you press him a little bit more, this is the abortion stuff that I was referencing in that. This is kind of him saying like, no, we're not out of whack. We're not out of whack because this system should correct itself.
I think it's logically impossible for the House to be out of step with the electorate, because if that were the case, we're responsive to the voters every 2 years. The voters would just put in different representatives. That's part of the democratic process.
But it's worth mentioning here that it's virtually impossible to talk about representative government in Tennessee without talking about the issue of gerrymandering, slicing and dicing voting districts to fortify the power of the party in control, and how that can impact the democratic process.
So he's saying that if the legislature was out of step, that people would vote them out. And that's a really overly simplistic view of politics, because I know there's a lot of younger folks in the room, but essentially, this state used to be run by Democrats. It had a Democratic governor, it had a Democratic House, and a Democratic Senate. And in 2008, Obama was elected, and then in 2010, we had midterms, and the midterms were what, the shellacking is what they called it in the news. It was really bad for Democrats. It was kind of a backlash to the Obama presidency. And what ended up happening in that time was that we flipped. We became a mostly Republican House and a mostly Republican Senate. And it was in that year that there was redistricting. So redistricting happens every 10 years when the census comes out. And so in 2011, because we had a Republican-led House and Senate, they had the power of the pen to redraw the districts. So it was the Republican Party, it's whoever is in control for that redistricting cycle, they get to draw the districts. And when you have it the next year, we have a supermajority. So it's not as simple as, well, people will just vote us out. The districts are drawn in a way to favor the party in control. And when the Republican Party's in control, they drew them to favor them. And there are, I think it's like 7 districts in the entire state that are actually competitive between the House and the Senate. So it's an overly simplistic view to think that we'll just vote them out, because not only is there gerrymandering, there's a lot of other things that I can talk about after that make it really hard to get somebody who is more moderate onto the ballot. And I'm kind of stepping away from the story for a little bit, but this is all kind of part of it, which is that I just wanted to put these up on the board a little bit, which is the primaries. And I'm sorry, these are literal like screen grabs from the Secretary of State website. So one thing to note is that Tennessee has the lowest voter turnout in the country. We're literally 51. Yay for us. So everybody should register and vote. Everybody should vote. But these are essentially...
We vote, right, y'all? We vote. Who votes? Who in this room votes? Who's gonna vote this fall? Sorry, I had to do it.
It's okay. Apologize. It's okay. I mean, it's a pretty abysmal score. We have an F in voter turnout, so we should be better than that. But I just wanted to point out, so because there's gerrymandering, because the districts are not competitive, the only thing that a Republican needs to win is the primary, okay? So that is what's setting people up for success, because once they win the primary, they get on the ballot as, the bona fide Republican candidate, and then you and your belief system go to the polls, and that belief system might be because your entire family is Republican, and you pull a Republican ballot, and then the person on there is Gino Bolso, and so you vote for him because he's a Republican. You don't really know much about him, but that's who you vote for. But the thing that's so important to realize is that the primaries, all you have to do is play to the base, right? So the people that are churning out, that are coming out to vote in primaries are just incredibly small. So if you look at, let's see, so Gino Bolso is at the top. So he gets elected with 5,100 votes. So that's essentially 5,100 votes gets him on the Republican ballot, and then he's in, because his district is largely Republican. They might not be his version of Republican, just like Melissa is not his version of Republican. She lives in his district. But she didn't know. She skipped the primary. She didn't know. She wasn't paying attention, like a lot of us. We're busy. And then with 5,100 votes, he gets put on the general election ballot, and he goes right in. And so I just wanted to do a couple, so William Lamberth is the, incredibly powerful House Majority Leader. These are the folks that carry the legislation. They have incredible power. 4,300 votes. I mean, how many, who has more followers on Instagram than that? Someone here does, right? Come on. I almost do. Jack Johnson, who's the Senate Majority Leader. The Senate has bigger areas, so that's why the votes are more. But look at that. 12,000 votes. Cameron Sexton, the Speaker of the House. Not even 8,000 votes. Jeremy Faison, he's just another powerful, he's the head of the, lead of the Republican caucus. So it's like these, they're representing 70,000 voters, but the reality is they're getting in there with a fraction of that. And it's because people don't vote in primaries, and because they know that they can appeal to their base, and those diehard folks who they appeal to on maybe single issues like abortion or gun, Second Amendment stuff, or immigration or something, that they will come out and they will vote. And it's interesting, like, do you see how close Gary Humble and Jack Johnson are? Like, Gary Humble almost won in that primary. Gary Humble was very far to the right. But what that did to Jack Johnson was once a moderate. And he's primaried by a guy who's from the far right, and he starts to move far right too, because he knows he wants to get a piece of Gary Humble's. So the primaries are kind of like this space that is both, I think, very fertile for grassroots, advocacy work, but also it can take just a few votes to suddenly push a lawmaker to be very extreme. I mean, Jack Johnson was saying, I will never pass a red flag law. I will never pass a red flag law, because he was vulnerable to Gary Humble, who was fully NRA, Tennessee Firearms Association. And he needed to appeal to that group because that guy is a threat to him in the primaries. So the fact that our primaries are just kind of so isolated, and they're just everybody who's going to the polls are these kind of single issue voters, makes it so that people that are quite extreme can get into office very easily, but also people that are not as extreme can be primaried, and then those people, as a response, will become more extreme to compete with the person that's primarying them. So, a little lesson on primaries, very important, please vote in them. One of the things that I did was I've looked at these three women as these kind of conservatives, but realizing they're relatively moderate in a lot of ways. And I looked at another moderate, longtime legislator, which is Senator Richard Gibbs. And Richard Gibbs is he's kind of like the ultimate statesman. I mean, he's a retired Army colonel, he's a heart surgeon, just very accomplished. And also, he considers himself to be a deeply conservative Republican. But in this moment in time, he is essentially, as I described, a loser on the winning team. Because he's now taking more moderate stances. Moderate stances being he wants exception. His big thing is exceptions to the abortion law, because as a doctor, he sees this from a very kind of public health standpoint, which is that a woman needs to get care if she has a fetus that isn't viable, or that her health is at risk. So he was the one who got the exception for the life of the mother, but he has every session come back and tried to get more exceptions, and he cannot do it. And this session I followed him as he tried to get exceptions into the abortion law for fetal anomalies. So your fetus is so in some way kind of so developmentally struggling that it will not survive outside the womb, right? These are things like maybe the heart is developing outside the body, or the brain is developing, there's a leak or something. This is a child that will not survive. But in current law, women cannot get that pregnancy terminated. They have to go out of state. And he really feels like this is an issue that he wants to make it safer for women to be able to, he's like, this is pro-life, I'm trying to make babies, not kill babies. Because a lot of times what happens with women, if they are not able to get care, is they get sepsis, they can die, or they can become sterile because they'll need a hysterectomy. And so to him, this is not he's saying, this is not me killing a baby, this is a baby that would not survive, and I am allowing this woman to have another baby in the future. But it's a losing game for him. And I asked him to kind of tell me a little bit about why things are this way, and
whoever
this way.
Screams the loudest gets heard, even though they're out of step with the general Republican voters. The voices are so strong up here that people are afraid to do what the majority of even conservative Republicans would like to have done. That's what's frustrating.
And do you see that as disruptive?
I don't know if it's disruptive, but it's not good democracy.
But Briggs is about to discover that the outside forces governing the majority are much, much bigger than he ever imagined. And what will happen to him is basically Melissa's worst case scenario for what might happen to her if she's elected, becoming a loser on the winning team.
So you just got a hint of something that develops in the story, which is that Melissa Alexander starts to think about primarying Gino Bolso. Because she's like, I could primary Gino Bolso, I could win 5,100 votes, like I live in his district. But what she starts to realize is that the Republicans in the state, the GOP, has started to change the rules of who can get on the ballot. And that's something that I feel is like, I almost want to do like a PSA about this, but it's like you have to be pretty extreme to even get on the ballot. You have to be a bona fide Republican, which means that you have to have voted in 3 out of the last 4 primaries. And if you've ever voted like Democrat in the last 4 election cycles, you cannot get on the ballot. And if you've tried to sue the party in any way, even a winning lawsuit, then you can't for 10 years try to run as a Republican. So while in the Democratic side of things, you basically have to be like alive and breathing to get on the ballot, the Republicans have just cinched it really, really tight. And so she starts to realize that. But she also, in her own evolution, starts to think about what these more hardline Republicans are and the way she sees them, like Gino. So this is her kind of wrestling with that.
When I've asked political scientists what they make of this discrepancy, they believe that Republican politicians bucking their electorate will generate backlash among their own constituents.
I think my political views or my views on certain things are not this MAGA type.
Republicans, like Melissa,
It almost feels a little bit like that feeling of like that pit in my stomach that, wow, like this is a little bit dangerous, this ideology, and it's scary. It scares me a little.
Melissa's aware that Gino Bolso is up for re-election this year. And now that she's paying attention to what's going on at the State House, she begins to wonder, what might it take to unseat him?
So she learns a lot in that journey. If you listen, you will learn too. I just have one more thing that I want to leave you with before I open it for questions, which is kind of where we started, which is this idea of democracy. And I think, you know, what you saw with these women was they walk in to talk about gun control and they realize there's all these other issues that they care about and there's all these other issues that they're seeing. And they can't ignore that. They can't ignore that, yes, they're there to get gun control, but now what they see is this wall of power that refuses to listen to them, that takes their signs away, that is, you know, telling them that they can't sit in certain places. And the abortion stuff and voting rights, I mean, they're just all of it. It's like this tidal wave of stuff. And I want to play a piece of tape that was not in the podcast, but it is something that's by Ann Applebaum, and it's something that I've come back to again and again while I've reported this, and it's really kind of the framing of this story, I feel like, ends up coming back to this. And it's this moment where she had a conversation with John Meacham at Vanderbilt, and she was talking about kind of what is happening in our country and the way we as citizens have thought about America, the greatest democracy in the world, and kind of what she's seen reporting in other countries where this democracy isn't necessarily a given. And I just want to play this because I really felt like this is what I watched the women go through, and this is what I want everybody possible to go through this moment.
You know, it's almost as if we treated democracy and we treated our political system in the past as if it were water running out of a tap. You know, you just turn it on and it comes out, and there's nothing really special that you have to do. You just have to show, maybe you vote every 4 years, maybe you don't really bother to do that.
You pay the water bill.
You pay the water bill, you know, some people do politics over there, you know, some professional politicians, and the rest of us get on with, we just make money or we paint paintings or whatever it is that we do. We don't really have to worry about it. Politics doesn't take up any important part of our brains like it does in so many other countries. And And the point is that was the piece of it that was illusory. We became very lazy. And actually politics does require, effort and time and people's commitment. And you can't just let a bunch of professional politicians run everything, because then they take things in directions you don't want them to go. And really beginning to think of it's not water coming out of tap, it's water in a well, and people have to go and get it and bring it back in buckets or whatever. The ending this era of complacency, I think is what is now upon us.
So I find that to be like just such an interesting analogy. It's like, no, we gotta go to the well, we gotta pick our buckets up, we gotta drag them back to the house. And that's what I felt like I watched these women do. I mean, in all of their privilege, which they had lots of it, they suddenly were like, wait, I can't turn my faucet on, I gotta go to the well, the state house, I gotta advocate. And I feel like what Anne is saying is that, yes, like in America, we've really taken a lot of this for granted, that it just works. I mean, there are problems, we've always talked about the problems, but by and large, we're the best version of democracy there is, right? But it doesn't always stay, and it takes work to maintain that. And I think right now we're in this moment where I hope we're realizing that we've got to do the work, that the age of complacency for all of us has to be over. And we have to really realize that democracy is not a given, it's something that we work for. And so that is the end of my little spiel, but I would love to have questions from anybody about the process of making the show or about politics.
First, thank you for being here. I really enjoyed the Kids of Rutherford County when I listened to it, but I have to know, why is it that it seems like journalists use words like growth or development with these positive connotations when they're describing moving away from conservative values, and it doesn't seem to be used when you move the other direction or when you become more educated and confident in your conservative values?
Do you mean like the idea of like the evolution? Because I don't know, like that kind of like what I'm saying, like they're evolving or?
Yeah, it just seems to me like when you read this type of media, these types of stories, it's only described as positive if the person is changing their mind and moving away from conservative values. But if they're going the other direction, if they're becoming more conservative, it seems like they're just being kind of lost in translation or uneducated, or it's not growth or positivity or described in those ways.
I mean, I feel like it's a little hard to answer that from my perspective because I've never really written stuff like that where it's like someone's moving to be more conservative and I'm kind of saying that they're regressing. I think what is different right now, and I will borrow another phrase from Ann Applebaum, what she said is that she feels like what's different compared to all the other iterations of our politics in the past is that a portion, and I'm going to say that a portion of one party wants to change the rules and get power and keep that power forever. And that portion happens to be proselytizing a very conservative ideology. And so I do think that that is the difference of kind of like where we're at as a society, is that there's a portion of one party, the Republican Party, that is trying to rig the system in their favor. And that feels scary and different. And so maybe when you were thinking about someone going more into conservatism, there's a worry of like that they're going more into the kind of like by any means necessary, even if it's wrong, even if it feels wrong, you gotta do what's right. And that's kind of what's in the water right now, it feels like. I would say like when I'm talking about growth and change, I'm talking about people growing up, being told something, and then starting to think on their own and realizing what their true values are. And to me, that's growth no matter which direction it is, right? For these women, they were still very much conservatives, but what they were realizing is that they did believe in a woman's right to choose to a certain degree. And they did believe that, you know, our prison population was too large once they sat in a hearing where they heard about, you know, all of it. Like they were starting to think on their own about certain things that they'd kind of just been spoon-fed their whole lives. And that to me feels like immense growth. And so I just want to be specific that I don't know, like, I think media, it's a very interesting time to be a working journalist because there are a lot of assumptions that, you know, when we write something, we're kind of already agenda driven. My only agenda in this was like, I want to talk to Republicans because Republicans have power. I'm not trying to say I got to talk to Democrats and Republicans. I'm saying that I think that there's a spectrum within the Republican Party that we're not seeing. And that, yes, there's a portion of that party that's doing some very damaging and troubling and anti-democratic things, but there's also a big portion of that party that just wants to live their American values. And we need more of those people to stand up and say, I don't want to align with an authoritarian. Like, I want to align with someone who I believe represents my values. But it just feels like a lot of times that's not happening enough. And it felt like what I was watching with these women said it was happening. It was really, really cool. It was really cool to see that. Yeah.
Hi, Ethan Schmidt. I'm actually writing my honors thesis on, has some podcasts, but I'm partly working, I'm doing my podcast on like trying to interview candidates who don't take any corporate PAC money. So I wanted to ask you, like, what does the role of like corporate money in politics have to do with maintaining the Republican majority in the state legislature?
Oh, I mean, money is everything. I mean, money drives everything. And it's, I mean, essentially, there's just so many alliances and so many special interests that it has a huge impact. Because but the money is also how you play. So you've seen kind of like the extreme version of this where, yes, I mean, super PACs will be, you know, funneling money into all of these campaigns, and those super PACs are somehow linked to the NRA or to the Tennessee Firearms Association or Tennessee Right to Life, and they will write bills and they will push all this stuff. And if you don't take that, like, you are severely crippled in your attempts. But then at the same time, we're also kind of conflicted about how to actually use money in a way that feels a bit more, well, I'm just going to say, like, I don't know if anyone followed the kind of dust up over Tennessee, Voices for a Safer Tennessee, which is a bipartisan gun control group who gave money to Cameron Sexton and Lieutenant Governor Randy McNally and a few other Republicans, and they got like a lot of flack for doing that because a lot of folks, and it's true, I mean, Cameron Sexton has like been hugely obstructionist in trying to pass any kind of gun safety. And so they were just like raked over their coals for doing that and looked down upon by all these other advocacy groups. But I do think the question is like, well, I mean, we've put money into politics. You can't like put the genie back in the bottle, you know, and they're giving these folks money because Cameron Sexton carries the legislation that will get passed. They're trying to curry favor because that's the currency. You know, you give money to somebody and then they do something for you, and that's just how the game is played in politics. So it does feel like money is driving far too much of everything we do, and if you don't have that, you are severely crippled in your attempt to, you know, overcome those who are backed by these deep-pocketed special interest groups. But then at the same time, when you're forming your own PAC as, you know, Voices for a Safer Tennessee, and then you give that money, like, you are then just attacked mercilessly for doing that. But at the same time, it's like, they didn't make those rules. Like, the rules have been made for a long time that you got to line the pockets of the people who carry the legislation. So it feels like we're in this moment where we can't quite decide, like, whether we want someone to, like, who is, like, we're very binary in our thinking, right? So it's like, they gave any money, oh my God, no, how could you? But I think it's more complicated than that because this is how the game is played. But obviously, like, corporate special interest, I mean, it's essentially, like, it's just, like, ruined a lot of stuff. I mean, Citizens United was terrible. So that's a good topic to study, though. Keep digging in. Anybody else have questions?
Well, I want to thank you for coming to
Oh, yeah.
speak to everybody. struck me as she was talking about it, when you land the facts and figures I gave you to begin with, what she was talking about. Guess what percentage of Tennesseans voted in the primary in August? 15%. 15. 85% didn't do it. That's why we are where we are, so I hope you all, whatever side of the political spectrum you're on, I think that you should vote. You know, let your voice be heard. Otherwise, somebody else's voice is going to be heard, and you might not be listened to at all. Mary.
So, was it, only I'm not going there. To what extent did a light bulb go off in these women's heads? That the fact that they were women, they had absolutely no power to speak to those men in power.
Oh, the light bulb, oh, it went off, I mean, it went off. And I mean, it was wild to watch them every day. I mean, you know, one senator called them the hot moms from Nashville. Another, Jeremy Faison, when they were going through security, said, I wish all the advocates looked like you ladies. Like, it's just blatant.
Where were their husbands?
Where were their husbands?
Yeah, were they embarrassed over their wives?
No, but it was, you could see these women were stepping out in a lot of ways. And their husbands were noticeably absent at times, not because they didn't support them, but they were not as interested as these women were. And part of like what they discovered as they did this was they really found their voice. And that looked very different for each woman. But
Didn't the little lady response drive them to complete and utter outrage?
Yes. I mean, it's, like they were constantly talked down to, like but here's the thing, like in some ways they were so used to it. So they almost like, it was so frustrating for them to go in there and say like, no, I've studied this, I've read the things, I want you to hear me. And they would just, kind of pat them on the back and say, okay. And they'd nod and then they'd turn around and do something totally different. So they have truly found their voices in like, from when I started working with them to when I ended, it was like the stuff that, even just what they were posting on their social medias, which is all like open now, they don't have any, like it's not restricted in any way or private. I mean, they were just getting to be very vocal about stuff. And I'm really interested to see like next year what they do, because the challenge for them is that they kind of think they can do it all, and I'm just not sure if they can. You know, they kind of think they can still go in there just to the nines and, you know, kind of bat their eyelashes and be like, okay, but we're smart. And it's like, at some point they're starting to pivot, but they're going to have to pivot more, and it's going to be really interesting to see, you know.
Where are things now in the story, and where do you think things are going?
Yeah, I should have said, so at the end of the session, well, at the end of the special session, the women got nothing passed. At the end of the regular session, they had helped pass 3 bills. They were small but meaningful bills. One of them was essentially to create a system in which when the fire alarm goes off in a school, the immediate response is not to walk out of the door, which is how the children at Covenant were killed. They thought that it was a fire alarm, and they did exactly what they had been told to do, which is to line up, and you have a line leader, and you go out the door, and what happened was they got shot. And so what the women did was they proposed a piece of legislation that gives a 2-minute kind of assessment period of what is the source of the alarm. Is it a fire? Is it an active shooter? What is happening before anybody leaves the classrooms so that that won't happen again? Which was great. It's a small but really meaningful change. They could not get it passed during the special session, which was like mind-boggling to me, but they did get it passed during the regular session. The other piece of legislation was to restrict access to child autopsies, which was something that they were really passionate about because of the children that were killed and the families and the fact that autopsies are considered public record. So there was some more kind of restrictions put in place as to whether those are accessible to the public just out of a simple request, or whether there was kind of a few other steps of permission being given. And then the third one, which is actually the women wrote it with Harold Love, is a bill that basically it creates a child fatality review board, and it collates all of the child gun death data, which we know well, do we know? That's the question, that the number one killer of children is firearms in Tennessee. And essentially what they wanted to do was to try to just disseminate that report to as many people as possible, hoping that like people would have a similar reaction that they have, which is to get up and do something once they see it right in front of them. So they created a board that would send it out to every pediatrician, every school principal, and I think one other place, so that it could start to trickle down to parents, so that people can just start to know more about how guns are negatively affecting children. So those were 3 bills. They were small, but they got them passed. But honestly, otherwise, the only major piece of legislation that did pass, which is at the end of the series, is the Army Teachers Bill. So the bill to allow teachers to carry a concealed weapon in school, that passed. So to them, that was a huge affront. Like, it was like the opposite of what they wanted. Now, I should say that, like, again, talking about being out of step with the electorate, like, the legislature passes this bill that will allow teachers to carry concealed firearms and not have to tell the parents who, like, nobody will know who has the firearm. That passed. Now, there's a couple things, like the director of schools, the principal, and the police chief all have to agree that this person can carry, so it's not like just anybody can like walk into a school. There are many of the things that Republicans have kind of balked at, saying like background checks, all these things, like that has to happen in this case. But the thing that's really interesting is up until this moment, if like my reporting is correct, not a single school district has opted into this. So they pass this bill, it creates all this commotion, national news, and not a single school district is saying, we actually want this, we want to do this. So that in and of itself shows you that the electorate is putting a lot of energy into stuff that is not even being adopted on the ground level. And when I think about the hours of debate that I watched, the hours of lobbying that these women did, which is captured in the last episode, so much work was put into stopping that bill or trying to get that bill passed, and it has had no effect. Like, nobody has taken it up. So what does that say? That we're spending a lot of time on things that are not really resonating with the citizens, right? So,
Where can people listen to your podcast, and how can they follow you?
oh, yes, well, you can listen to it on, it's NPR embedded, so it's like, it's called Supermajority, so you can just search for that in your podcast app, you can find it, but it's on the NPR embedded podcast. That's what you search for, like embedded, and then it's in there. But then also, if you just Google like NPR Supermajority, they have it all up on the NPR website, so you can listen to them there. And then have me follow me at Meribah on Instagram. Although I'm private, so I'll have to look at you and be like, is that or you can find me on Facebook, because I'm totally open, Meribah Knight.
Since every time I hear one of your podcasts, I bring you to campus, what's your next one on?
Oh God, I'm still figuring that out. I'm helping with another one that has to do with, we have a reporter at Dillon in Erbil right now in northern Iraq. We're working on a story about the connections and the kind of migration, the waves of migration from Kurdistan to Nashville, which, if those of you don't know, we have the largest Kurdish community in the country. So I'm working with her, telling kind of this really intimate story of migration and sacrifice and family ties and family splintering. So this is the first time in like 5 years that I haven't had like a project immediately teed up. Usually they overlap, and so I was like, the politics just didn't end. I mean, a little bit, but we're working on cool stuff. So.
Well, if any of you want to be journalists, Meribah is the real deal. So use her as an example. Thank you so much for coming.